As they are intended to do, those mines maim and kill those who step on them. They're indiscriminate. Anyone going about their normal daily life can accidentally tread on them. It needn't be a heavy foot. A child's footstep will do it. All Azerbaijan wants is to remove the mines quickly and safely before they kill and maim more people. And it's hard to see that Armenia has any legitimate interest in obstructing this aim. Armenia knows where the mines are. It has information, including maps, that show where the mines are. In June 2021, Armenia provided Azerbaijan with maps purportedly outlining the location of 189,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, and the Armenian Prime Minister said that this was only, and I quote, a tiny part of the landmine maps which it possesses. And even those turned out to be largely inaccurate. Azerbaijan has asked repeatedly for detailed, comprehensive, and accurate information about the placement of the landmines. Tab 1 in your folders is an 11-page list of some of those requests. Azerbaijan has tried to negotiate the handover of that information, among other issues that limp on in the aftermath of the 3-decade-long occupation. And others, including the EU, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the United States of America, have made the same calls for the handover of that information. But Armenia refuses to give it up. That is how the case looks with the carpet lifted. And that is the question. Must the people of Azerbaijan spend the years until the court rules on the merits of the case, picking their way through unmarked minefields, while Armenia sits on the information that would enable the safe and prompt removal of those landmines? It's against this backdrop that Azerbaijan requests the provisional measures set out on the slide. The request asks that the court order Armenia to provide Azerbaijan with detailed and accurate maps of the hundreds of thousands of landmines which its military and those under its control have planted throughout Azerbaijan's territory. Cease its mining operations, which have been continuing as recently as May of this year, when a covert group of Armenians was arrested planting yet more mines in Azerbaijan's territory. Prevent organizations from operating in Armenia which incite and propagate racially motivated hate speech and encourage violence against Azerbaijanis. Prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence relevant to allegations of ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis, of which it is aware, including those identified in communications from the Republic of Azerbaijan. Refrain from aggravating the resolution of the dispute, and lastly, to report to the court on the measures so ordered. Armenia is currently engaged in activities in breach of paragraphs A to E, and it has given no indication that it recognizes that it is bound by legal obligations to cease and desist from engaging in them. Madam President, with those requests in mind, I turn to the question of prima facie jurisdiction. There is no need to linger over the question whether there is a dispute between the parties concerning the interpretation and application of the CERD. Azerbaijan's case is that Armenia is engaged in the practice of ethnic cleansing directed towards Azerbaijanis. It's hard to imagine a clearer or more serious accusation of a breach of the rights under CERD. My colleagues will take you to further details on this point, but that a dispute under CERD exists is, we believe, accepted by both parties. Then there is the precondition of negotiation set out in CERD Article 22. Azerbaijan said last week that Armenia could not request provisional measures because it could not show that negotiations had failed or become futile. Armenia has not engaged with negotiations, but has walked away from them and has turned instead to the court. It cannot rely on its own wrongdoing in order to establish the jurisdiction of the court. This principle is firmly established by a long line of authority. Azerbaijan is not relying on its own wrongdoing. It has pursued the possibility of a negotiated settlement on matters covered by the request. It has put forward specific proposals on steps to be taken to address Armenia's claim. The documents underlying the negotiations are to be kept confidential, and the court has advised that they are not to be displayed or quoted in this hearing, but a number of such documents have been filed in evidence. You'll see that exchanges began in November 2020, but it was almost 6 months later, in late April this year, before the parties agreed on the modalities of the negotiations. And it was July 2021 before discussions opened up to substantive questions. But I invite the court to review all of the documents that track the progress or lack of progress in the negotiations. But I mention 3 in particular. First, the letter from the Armenian Minister of Foreign Affairs to Azerbaijan's Minister of Foreign Affairs, dated 11 November 2020. Second, the letter from Azerbaijan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Armenia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, dated 8th December 2020. And third, the letter outlining the proposals put forward by Azerbaijan to Armenia in the negotiations of 31st August 2021. Azerbaijan submits that those 3 documents, borne out by the rest of the record, shows that there was a very significant evolution in Azerbaijan's position, made in its search for a negotiated solution to the matters in dispute. Azerbaijan made, in the words of the court, a genuine attempt to engage in discussions with the other party, with a view to settling the dispute. Azerbaijan satisfied the precondition of negotiations set out in CERD Article 22 with respect to its claims, even though Armenia, in its recalcitrance, did not do so with respect to its own. Madam President, I turn next to the question whether the present dispute raises a plausible case concerning Azerbaijan's rights under the CERD. It appears from last week's hearing to be common ground that the court has the power to indicate provisional measures, so long as it is satisfied that the rights asserted by the requesting party are at least plausible. As my colleagues will explain in more detail, each of the provisional measures requested by Azerbaijan engages the rights under the CERD. Indeed, the claims to rights goes well beyond the threshold of plausibility. Take, for example, the landmines laid by Armenia in the formerly occupied territories. By laying hundreds of thousands of mines throughout the Karabakh region, and as Ms. Amirfar will detail in a moment, doing so deliberately in civilian areas previously home to ethnic Azerbaijanis. Armenia has made it impossible for them to return to their homes, although many wish to do so. Court will hear evidence that many have lost their lives since November 2020, and many more have been injured. It is clear that Azerbaijan's rights under the CERD are being violated. Article 1, paragraph 1 of the CERD states that racial discrimination means, quote, any distinction, exclusion, restriction or preference based on race, colour, descent or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life, end quote. Ethnic cleansing amounts to a violation of just about every limb of that definition. It has both the purpose and effect of nullifying or impairing, to take some examples from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of life, the right to liberty and security of person, and the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose one's residence. CERD Article 2 obliges Armenia to, quote, condemn racial discrimination and undertake to pursue by all appropriate means and without delay a policy of eliminating racial discrimination, and requires that the state shall not engage in any act or practice of racial discrimination against persons or groups of persons. Third, Article 5 requires Armenia to guarantee the right to security of persons and protection against bodily harm, whether inflicted by government officials or by any individual group or institution. All of these CERD rights and obligations are clearly engaged in the present dispute by Armenia's conduct in relation to the landmines, and it's unnecessary to multiply the example. I could draw further examples from Armenia's cyber campaign of disinformation. This is a sophisticated and coordinated operation designed to worsen relations between the two peoples. Twitter has documented that fake accounts have been created on its social media platform and that they are linked to the government of Armenia. Accounts posing as Azerbaijani officials carried messages promoting hatred towards Armenians in order to stir up anti-Azerbaijani sentiment. That is a plain violation of CERD Article 2, Paragraph 1 and Article 4. To take a third example, Armenia permits, and still worse facilitates, violent groups of extremists who propagate hate speech and promote violence towards Azerbaijanis. Professor Boisson de Chazourne will take the court in detail through two examples of such groups and show that members of at least one group have been invited by the Armenian government to join its military efforts in the Karabakh region as, I quote, snipers. That too violates CERD Article 2, Paragraph 1 and Article 4. And it's one of the factors that means that Armenia is breaching CERD Article 7. It is, we submit, beyond doubt that there is a plausible case that the rights under the CERD are not only engaged, but are currently being violated. And my colleagues will take you through more evidence shortly. Finally, I turn to the urgency of Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures. There's a good deal of common ground between the approaches of Armenia and Azerbaijan to the principles that govern this matter. Two states agree that the continuing promotion of hatred against ethnic groups is making the resolution of this dispute more difficult, as these attitudes become ingrained in new generations of citizens. Both states also agree that the infliction of death and maiming causes harm that is irreparable, and that there is an urgent need for measures to avert such risks. The disagreement is over the facts and the practical need for such measures. Our criticisms of Armenia's requests focused on the point that they were based upon mistaken facts, or were moot, or had no basis in any plausible right under CERD. The landmines, the cyber campaign, and the sponsorship of hate groups all present immediate and continuing threats, and all are demonstrated by current evidence on file in this case. So too is the risk of the destruction of evidence relating to ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis, as my colleague Ms. Natalie Reid will explain in detail. Armenia has failed to investigate and to preserve evidence of atrocities committed during the First Karabakh War, its 30-year occupation, and the Second Karabakh War. While many of these breaches of Azerbaijanis' rights, including the examples set out at paragraph 20 of Azerbaijan's Provisional Measures Request, have been catalogued by independent third parties, such as Human Rights Watch, it is still important that primary evidence be preserved for submission to state courts and other authorities in order to allow Azerbaijanis to receive effective protection or remedies as required by CERD. This includes evidence specifically in relation to unlawful executions, torture and mistreatment, desecration of deceased servicemen, and the indiscriminate planting of landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. Madam President, honourable members of the Court, I thank you for your attention, and my colleagues will now address you in more detail on each of Azerbaijan's requests. That brings my submissions today to a close, and I ask that you now invite Ms. Catherine Amirfar to the lectern.
I thank Professor Lowe for his statement, and I now invite Ms. Catherine Amirfar to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, honorable members of the Court, it is an honor to appear before you again on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan. I will address the first and second provisional measures requested. In its first request, Azerbaijan asked the Court to order Armenia to take all necessary steps to enable it to swiftly, safely, and effectively demine the landmines laid in Azerbaijan's territory by Armenia. In its second request, Azerbaijan asked the Court to order Armenia to immediately cease and desist from its continued planting, promotion, or facilitation of the planting of landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. In accordance with the Court's settled jurisprudence regarding the indication of provisional measures, I will speak to, in turn, the plausibility of the rights invoked, the link between those rights and the requested measures, and the imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights in dispute. Each of Azerbaijan's first and second requests clearly, to use the Court's words, quote, concern plausible rights under the CERD which require protection pending the final decision of the Court in the case, end quote. With respect to plausibility, I will make 3 points. First, the acts complained of are part of Armenia's long-standing campaign of ethnic cleansing, deliberately targeting the previously expelled ethnic Azerbaijani population to prevent them from returning home to the formerly occupied territories. Second, Armenia's acts constitute acts of racial discrimination as defined in Article 1.1 of CERD, because they have both the purpose and the effect of depriving Azerbaijanis of their equal enjoyment of fundamental rights. Third, Armenia's conduct violates its obligations and the rights protected under Articles 2 and 5 of CERD. To my first point, as you heard last week, Armenia has laid hundreds of thousands of landmines in the formerly occupied territories. Many of Armenia's landmines have been laid specifically and deliberately in civilian areas with no conceivable military objective, for the very purpose of preventing the return home of the hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis displaced from those areas by Armenia's systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing. Armenia's ongoing refusal to enable the clearing of these deadly landmines is just the latest chapter in that campaign. As it stands today, this region is among the most contaminated and dangerous landmine zones in the entire world. And without the court's urgent intervention, it is estimated that it would take up to a decade to clear these landmines to allow Azerbaijanis to return safely home. So how did this tragic state of affairs come about? Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign began in the late 1980s, when Armenia forcibly expelled more than 200,000 ethnic Azerbaijanis from Armenia. And it only intensified during the First Karabakh War, which resulted in Armenia's decades-long occupation of nearly 20% of Azerbaijani territory and the expulsion and murder of the Azerbaijanis living there. Between 1991 and 1994, Armenia expelled more than 700,000 Azerbaijanis from the formerly occupied territories, historically Dagh Qarabağ and the 7 surrounding districts of Azerbaijan. These surrounding districts at the time were home to a population that was 98% ethnic Azerbaijani. This population has remained internally displaced for nearly 3 decades. As part of its campaign of ethnic cleansing, Armenia deliberately planted hundreds of thousands of landmines in the formerly occupied territories during occupation, then as Armenian forces retreated, and even after the cessation of hostilities in November 2020. The Mine Action Agency of the Republic of Azerbaijan, ANAMA, an Azerbaijani agency formed with the support of the United Nations Development Program, is charged with the critical task of making the formerly occupied territories safe for displaced Azerbaijanis to return home. ANAMA prepared the map that you see on your screen based on its technical survey process and estimates. This map illustrates the pervasive pattern of Armenia's landmine contamination in the formerly occupied territories. The areas of high contamination, noted in red on the map, cut across the former line of contact, an area in close proximity to densely populated regions of Azerbaijan, as represented by the black dots, indicating the towns, settlements, and villages. Landmines also contaminate the land throughout the formerly occupied territories in the districts, that is, the civilian areas, where the population was overwhelmingly Azerbaijani before Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign. Before I use the same map prepared by ANAMA, overlaid with the populations of ethnic Azerbaijanis that were displaced from each of the regions represented. The crisscrossing areas colored orange and yellow on the map before you, indicating medium and low landmine contamination, are far from the theater of active hostilities, far from any legitimate military target. The pattern of placement of the landmines renders any attempted return especially deadly. ANAMA's work has confirmed that Armenia planted mines on access roads to cities in and around the formerly occupied territories, as well as, and I quote, agricultural fields, graveyards, gardens, and other areas of social and economic utility, end quote. This deliberate endangerment of civilian lives demonstrated Armenia's commitment to prevent any safe return after the end of hostilities. As of June 2021, ANAMA had removed 34,590 mines, as reflected in the internal report of 11 June 2021 that is in your folders at tab 3. ANAMA's survey documented mines throughout the formerly occupied territories, as displayed on the map now on your screen. ANAMA found that as they withdrew, Armenian forces had planted landmines in cities and villages in the Zigilan, Gubadli, Jebrayil, Khojavand districts, and in Dishalta village of Shusha city. As the map shows, and ANAMA cataloged, these towns and villages were far away from the line of contact. Photographs in the report also record the civilian areas in which these mines were found, including in ruined Azerbaijani graveyards in Medavar village in Agdam, and open fields in Kanlik village, Gubadli, and Ashagi Irim village in Kalbajar. The deliberate placement of these mines, including concealed under tumbled gravestones, has no conceivable military objective or justification. In particular, based on its observations that the landmines also were, quote, buried in fields utilized in the past 3 to 5 years for agricultural purposes, end quote, ANAMA ultimately concluded that Armenia had, quote, deliberately mined, end quote, these civilian areas, quote, during the forced withdrawal, end quote. Like Armenia's other destructive acts in the formerly occupied territories, including its devastation of the natural environment and razing of villages, towns, and cities, Armenia's salting of the earth with deadly landmines in these civilian areas is designed to deter return by the displaced ethnic Azerbaijani population. The threat posed by Armenia's landmines is not an idle one. Approximately 3,000 Azerbaijanis were maimed or killed by landmines from 1999 to present. And as documented in your folder at tab 4, at least 160 Azerbaijanis, including 65 Azerbaijani civilians, have been killed or injured by landmines since the cessation of hostilities last November. The positions Armenia has taken are not political theater. They are calculated to intimidate and prevent Azerbaijanis from returning. Make no mistake, although Armenia initially denied possessing any landmine maps, calling Azerbaijan's request for them a, quote, fake agenda, end quote, as recently as April of this year, Armenia finally admitted in June 2021 that it does indeed possess such maps. But as its prime minister also admitted, Armenia has refused to share anything but a, quote, tiny part, end quote, of the landmine location information in its possession. Instead, regardless of the innocent lives lost and the ever-present danger, Armenia would provide further information only if Azerbaijan immediately released Armenian detainees convicted of committing crimes or awaiting trial. Notably, even that, quote, tiny part, end quote, of maps Armenia has provided largely has been useless to mine clearing efforts. The maps provided only cover 3 of 7 districts, as shown on the map on the screen, leaving over half of the formerly occupied territories without information. And the information that was provided is clearly inadequate. Almost half of the information received from Armenia is incomplete, while 1/4 is either completely inaccurate or contains no information pertinent to demining. By intentionally withholding comprehensive and accurate information about its mine placement, Armenia all but assures that the displaced Azerbaijani population will continue to be unable to safely return to their homes in the formerly occupied territories. Moreover, Armenia continues to plant landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. As recently as 27 May 2021, over 6 months after the cessation of hostilities, Azerbaijan detained a reconnaissance and sabotage group of the Armenian armed forces who were attempting to plant landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. Armenia's prime minister did admit that very same day that, quote, mining work was carried out, end quote, even as he denied that it was on Azerbaijan's territory. In short, Armenia's deliberate mine contamination in and around the formerly occupied territories and its continued refusal to facilitate the clearance of those mines are an integral part of its campaign targeting Azerbaijanis for ethnic cleansing in those territories based on their national or ethnic origin. Second, Armenia's acts plausibly constitute racial discrimination within the meaning of Article 1.1 of the CERD. As the court has confirmed, quote, the Convention prohibits all forms and manifestations of racial discrimination, whether arising from its purpose or from its effect, end quote. Here, Armenia's acts had both the purpose and the effect of impairing the equal enjoyment exercise of fundamental rights of Azerbaijanis, quote, as a distinct social group based on their national or ethnic origin, end quote. To begin with, the location and placement of Armenia's landmines make their discriminatory purpose clear. As noted, Armenia's placement of these mines in clearly civilian areas, its ongoing refusal to provide crucial information in its possession, deliberately targets ethnic Azerbaijanis and seeks to ensure that the formerly occupied territories remain cleansed of the population it expelled 30 years ago. Tragically, the evidence before the court and the lived experience of many Azerbaijanis confirms that Armenia's discriminatory acts have also had their intended effect. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe noted in its resolution of 27 September 2021 that a great challenge for, quote, Azerbaijan is the return of the 650,000 displaced from the 1991-1994 war, and that 65% of these displaced persons would like to return to their homelands, end quote. Yet as a result of Armenia's deliberate and continued mine contamination, heavily concentrated in formerly Azerbaijani population centers, these hundreds of thousands of displaced Azerbaijanis are forced to remain in exile from their homes on pain of death or injury. Where Azerbaijani families have chosen to take the risk in seeking to return to their former homes, they have suffered terrible loss and horrific injuries. Hundreds of thousands more remain displaced in fear of death or serious injury, perpetuating the wrongs of Armenia's decade-long campaign of ethnic cleansing. Third, the specific rights under CERD that Azerbaijan invokes in connection with its request are, quote, at least plausible, end quote. The purposeful conduct I've described on the part of Armenia violates multiple substantive obligations under CERD. These include Article 2, which requires Armenia to refrain from engaging in any, quote, act or practice of racial discrimination against persons, groups of persons, or institutions, end quote, and correspondingly grants Azerbaijanis the right to be free of such discrimination, both individually and as a group. Armenia's conduct also violates its obligations under Article 5, which requires Armenia to, quote, eliminate racial discrimination in all of its forms, end quote, and to guarantee the enjoyment of a non-exhaustive list of protected rights without discrimination. These include the right to, quote, security of person and protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, end quote, in Article 5b, the right to, quote, freedom of movement and residence within the border of the state, quote, in Article 5d1, and the right to, quote, leave any country, including one's own, and to return to one's country, in Article 5d2. For the reasons I've just discussed, the evidence submitted demonstrates that Armenia has deprived Azerbaijanis of their equal enjoyment of these rights through its program of mine contamination, which continues to prevent Azerbaijanis from returning home to the formerly occupied territories and exposes them to risks of death or serious bodily injury should they attempt to do so. Azerbaijan thus respectfully submits that each of the first two requested measures easily concern rights under CERD that are plausible. I turn now to the second requirement, that, quote, a link must exist between the rights whose protection is sought and the provisional measures being requested, end quote. On this, I can be brief. Azerbaijan's first and second requested measures are clearly linked to the rights under the CERD that it seeks to protect. Azerbaijan asked the court first to order Armenia to take all steps to facilitate the clearing of landmines planted in its territory, namely through disclosing complete and accurate information regarding the locations of landmines throughout the formerly occupied territories, and second, to order Armenia to cease planting landmines within Azerbaijan. Each of these measures is aimed at preventing Armenia from carrying out discriminatory acts that perpetuate Armenia's campaign of ethnic cleansing against Azerbaijanis in the formerly occupied territories. The High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy recently underscored that Armenia's, quote, handing over of all available maps of mined areas, end quote, is crucial to, quote, avoid further civilian casualties, end quote. Indeed, the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe also stressed the, quote, urgent need to demine the areas affected by the conflict, end quote. And the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs reiterated the need for the, quote, exchange of all data necessary to conduct effective demining, end quote. In short, the requested measures are critical to facilitate the return of displaced Azerbaijanis to their home and communities in the formerly occupied territories and are thus aimed at safeguarding the specific rights under Articles 2 and 5 that Azerbaijan asserts under CERD. And finally, the requested measures meet the requirement of urgency because there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights in dispute pending the court's final decision. One is hard-pressed to think of a greater demonstration of urgency and irreparable harm than the prospect of even more innocent lives lost and even more people seriously injured by triggering landmines when such loss and injury could be prevented by the measure requested. The court has previously indicated provisional measures in 3 cases to protect fundamental rights under CERD. In each of these cases, the court has recognized that there are rights under CERD, to quote the court in Ukraine v. Russia, which are of such a nature that prejudice to them is capable of causing irreparable harm. The court recognized this explicitly with respect to the specific rights at risk for each of Azerbaijan's requests, namely Articles 5b, 5d, and 5e. In Georgia v. Russia, for example, the court found that, quote, violations of the right to security of persons and of the right to protection by the state against violence or bodily harm could involve potential loss of life or bodily injury and could therefore cause irreparable prejudice, end quote. The court also found in that case that, quote, violations of the right to freedom of movement and residence within a state's borders could also cause irreparable prejudice in situations where the persons concerned are exposed to privation, hardship, anguish, and even danger to life and health, end quote. And the court likewise concluded that, quote, individuals forced to leave their own place of residence and deprived of their right of return could, depending on the circumstances, be subject to a serious risk of irreparable prejudice, end quote. Every one of these circumstances applies in this case. Armenia's continuing violations of rights protected under CERD expose Azerbaijanis to the potential loss of life and risk of injury, deprive them of their right of return to their homes, and give rise to hardship and anguish. Azerbaijanis thus have already suffered and continue to suffer and be at a serious risk of irreparable prejudice based on Armenia's conduct. In addition, there's a real and imminent risk that this irreparable prejudice will occur prior to the court's decision on the merits. In its order of provisional measures in immunities and criminal proceedings, Equatorial Guinea v. France, the court found that such a risk exists when, quote, the acts likely to cause such a prejudice could occur at any moment, end quote. The court reaffirmed this conclusion in its recent order of provisional measures in Gambia v. Myanmar. The court has thus repeatedly found that the risk of irreparable harm is real and imminent where the affected group, quote, appears to remain vulnerable, end quote, to human rights violations. And it has repeatedly concluded this to be the case, where there is evidence that such violations are ongoing or past actions create a situation such that, quote, the impact on those affected seem to persist to this date, end quote. It is difficult to conceive of a greater demonstration of current and urgent vulnerability than the prospect of further loss of life and injury due to the landmines, as well as the ongoing violation of the rights of Azerbaijanis to return to their homes and go safely about their daily lives. Despite Azerbaijan's best efforts to clear as many landmines as quickly as possible, the number of landmine casualties continues to rise. At the current rate of mine clearance, and given the sheer number of mines planted by Armenia, ANAMA estimates that this tragic circumstance will last for potentially up to a decade. That is because, as the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has noted, and I quote, the conflict region is one of the most contaminated mines and unexploded ordnance regions in the world, end quote. This untenable situation of ongoing threat and continuing violations will remain unchanged unless and until Armenia provides Azerbaijan with the information it possesses to enable the clearance of existing landmines and stops planting additional mines in Azerbaijan's territory. Despite broad condemnation from the international community, Armenia has made clear that it has no intention of doing so voluntarily. Indeed, Armenia's Prime Minister reiterated earlier this month that Armenia would provide this desperately needed information only on the unreasonable condition that Azerbaijan grants blanket immunity to Armenian detainees who have been convicted of serious crimes. The Azerbaijani population affected thus remains under a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to their rights under CERD. Accordingly, the first and second measures requested satisfy all of the criteria for the indication of provisional measures set out in the court's just settled jurisprudence and are urgently needed to protect Azerbaijan's rights pending the resolution of these proceedings. Thank you, Madam President, honorable members of the court, for the privilege of appearing before you. I now kindly ask you, Madam President, to invite Professor Laurence Poisson de Cherzoun to address the court.
I thank Ms. Amirfar for her statement, and I now invite Professor Laurence Basson de Chazoun to take the floor.
Madam President, distinguished members of the court, it's for me an honor to come once again before you on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan. In its third provisional measure, Azerbaijan is trying to put to an end to Armenia's anti-Azerbaijani campaign of hate and violence. Armenian participation in this campaign of hatred and violence against Azerbaijanis is clear in two respects. First of all, Armenia has neither sanctioned nor punished the activities of armed ethno-nationalist hate groups, the Voshnalu Avest, also called Voma. Quite on the contrary, Armenia backs these groups. Secondly, by cyber disinformation operations, Armenia is circulating fake news and declarations aimed at fanning the flames of hate against the Azerbaijanis. This behavior by Armenia is a continuing violation of fundamental rights of Azerbaijanis as defined by the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, henceforth third. On this account, Madam President, provisional measures are necessary to protect these rights while this case is pending before the court. This request complies with the criteria of the court for the indication of provisional measures. Those rights that Azerbaijan seeks to protect are plausible. There is a clear link between these rights and the measures requested, and they are necessary to prevent an imminent risk of irreparable prejudice. I shall look at each of these points seriatim. Azerbaijan's claims regarding Armenia's failure, to prevent and punish operations of hate groups and relative to operations of cyber disinformation aiming to incite ethnic violence and promote racial hatred against Azerbaijanis, plausibly engage the rights of said persons under CERD, specifically Articles 2, 4, 5 and 7. Before getting into the detail of the plausibility of those rights adduced, let me first of all to make a few comments on the rights and obligations provided under Articles 2, 4, 5 and 7 of CERD. In a recent case, the court pointed out, I quote, that a state party to CERD can only rely on the rights under 2, 4, 5 and 7, quote, only if the acts complained of appear to constitute acts of racial discrimination as defined in Article 1 of the Convention. Now, as the court has observed, Article 2 and 5, I quote, are intended to protect individuals from racial discrimination by obliging states parties to undertake certain measures. These measures consist of engaging in no act or practice of racial discrimination, and not to sponsor, defend or support racial discrimination by any persons or organizations, and to guarantee the right of everyone without distinction as to race, color, or national or ethnic origin to equality before the law, in the enjoyment of fundamental human rights, including, I quote, the right to security of person and protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, whether inflicted by government officials or by any individual group or institution, end of quote. Over and above these obligations, Articles 4 and 7 add broad protection against hate speech. Article 4, which is the key provision of the CERD with respect to hate speech, obliges states parties to condemn all propaganda and all organizations which are based on ideas or theories of superiority of one race or group of persons of one color or ethnic origin, or which attempt to justify or promote racial hatred and discrimination in any form. This article invites anti-discrimination legislation to be put in place. The convention as well does not allow public authorities, and public institutions to undertake racial discrimination or promote it. Article 7, as for it, provides that states parties undertake to adopt immediate and effective measures to fight against racial prejudice. After this short expose on the different articles, there is no doubt, distinguished members of the court, that those rights claimed by Azerbaijan under Articles 2, 4, 5 and 7 are plausible since they are grounded in a possible interpretation of the third. The first point that I'm now going to look at is the question of Armenia's failure to prevent or punish operations of hate groups on its territory, inciting ethnic violence against Azerbaijanis. This behavior of Armenia with respect to hate groups engages in more than plausible fashion rights guaranteed under Articles 2, 4, 5 and 7 of the third. Now, as I said in my introduction, VOMA is an armed ethno-nationalist hate group which abundantly promotes and incites to racial discrimination on its internet site and via social networks. They are operating openly in Armenia via a number of branches situated throughout the territory with the aim of recruiting and training Armenian civilians. Moreover, its support and links to the Armenian authorities, including the armed forces, are a source of pride to this group. VOMA is founded on the principle of Armenian ethnic superiority and promotes ethnic hatred against Azerbaijanis. You will be able to find under tab 5 of your files, your judges' files, pages 1 through 8, you'll find a raft of declarations available publicly on the VOMA website. Now, the group describes itself on its site as a militant nationalist movement aiming to put together a nation army of 100,000 Armenian citizens and diaspora to fortify all strategically important territory for the indigenous population. Now, this nation army of VOMA appeals to Armenian citizens and to people having at least 25% Armenian blood. The explicit objective of this nation army is the supposed threat of Azerbaijanis, or as VOMA calls them with hatred, the mixed Turkish pseudo-Islamic formations that VOMA declares its duty to purge from the, quote, sick body of Eurasia. Furthermore, over and above its website, this hate group shares regularly and actively racially discriminatory posts on the social networks, targeting Azerbaijanis as a national or ethnic group. Propaganda of VOMA has, as an effect, a dehumanization of Azerbaijanis by erasing their humanity and their ethnic identity. I would like to invite you once again to have a look at tab 5 of your judges' files. You will find there a slew of examples of the anti-Azerbaijani propaganda posted by VOMA on social networks, calling Azerbaijanis in pejorative fashion Turks, or Caspian Turks, or referring to Azerbaijan as the Caspian threat, which must be liquidated. Today, still, VOMA continues to incite to hatred and violence against Azerbaijanis. In March 2021, for example, this hate group invited its followers to join a military training camp in Armenia and posted on its Telegram channel a call to arms. You can see this on your screens, and it's also on the tab 5 of your judges folders, page 11. We now have even more motivation to become strong and achieve the above goal of eliminating Azerbaijan. In May 2021, VOMA published on its Facebook site the following declaration you can see on your screens. Now, this refers to Azerbaijanis as false Muslims and demonizes Azerbaijan as a wolf-worshipping terrorist state, against which Armenia stands as a civil outpost for the well-being of Christendom's future. No later than last month, VOMA posted on its Telegram channel, "We need to militarize. We need to get ourselves trained. We live in a mono-ethnic country, and if we consolidate ourselves and get prepared for war, then not only we will not lose anything, we'll gain." Armenia allows VOMA to operate with full impunity on its territory. You can see this inter alia from the presentations made by VOMA itself. The group continues to recruit new members, to collect funds, and to make use of training centers in Armenia. Armenia's active engagement in military cooperation with this group is revelatory. Indeed, VOMA flags that it has deployed artillery reconnaissance volunteers and snipers on the boundary between Azerbaijan and Armenia, who allegedly worked in close cooperation with Armenian armed forces and received a commendation by the command. By not sanctioning nor prohibiting anti-Azerbaijani paramilitary groups, Armenia has enabled these groups to proliferate on its territory. For example, the group statehood as a national value, known under its acronym, Armenian acronym naturally, POGA, P-O-G-A, allegedly started in March 2021 to organize military training programs to prepare Armenians of all ages for war. Moreover, the pages of POGA's social network, you can find a few extracts of those under tab 6 of your judges folders, regularly glorify Garichin Nedjek, founder of the ethno-nationalistic ideology Shigakron, and call Armenians to take up arms to fight for an extended Armenian homeland, including territory which is currently within the sovereign boundaries of Azerbaijan. Now, the ideology of Chekron promotes hatred on the basis of ethnic superiority of Armenians, and the writings of Nezhde call Armenians to defeat the enemy of my race, the Turks, and to preserve Armenia for Armenians. Now, just as for VOMA, Armenia has done nothing to sanction or prohibit POGA's operations on its territory. The breaches of Armenia are not merely that they do nothing. No, Armenia actively glorifies Nezhde, creating a favorable climate for hate groups. A massive statue in his likeness stands proudly in the central square of Yerevan. Madam President, by neither sanctioning nor prohibiting the operations of VOMA and similar groups and glorifying the racist ideology used to target Azerbaijanis, Armenia is violating, more than plausibly, the rights guaranteed under Articles 2, 4 and 7 of the CERD, and also the rights as Azerbaijanis guaranteed by Article 5b of the Convention regarding security of the person and protection against violence or bodily harm without distinction of national or ethnic origin. I move now to the Armenian hate campaign conducted via cyber disinformation operations. Now, these operations are both insidious and difficult to counter. They proliferate on social networks such as Twitter. And this social network, that's Twitter, has made public its investigations aimed at finding and suppressing from its platform state disinformation operations because of the nefarious impact in which they undermine the integrity of Twitter because they interfere in the public conversation. That's Twitter saying all of that. An investigation carried out by Twitter revealed the extent of state-affiliated information operations in Armenia. In detail, Twitter explains that, and quote, "Under our platform manipulation policy, we investigated and removed 35 accounts that had ties to the government of Armenia. These accounts were created in order to advance narratives that were targeting Azerbaijan, and in some cases, the fake accounts purported to represent government and political figures in Azerbaijan, as well as news entities claiming to operate in Azerbaijan. The totality of the data of tweets associated to these operations, about 70,000 tweets going back to 2014, including tweets of 10 fake government accounts and 5 fake news accounts. According to Stanford Internet Observatory, the most noteworthy tactic of the operations was the creation of accounts hijacking the identity of Azerbaijani officials. Inter alia, the current and former ministries of Foreign Affairs, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, the Minister of Defense, the President's advisor on Foreign Affairs, and the Vice President. Distinguished members of the court, there's no doubt that Armenia has direct ties with these accounts set up in the framework of the ongoing cyber disinformation campaign, or at the very least, allowed the creation of these accounts appearing to be Azerbaijani. These fake accounts linked to the government have disseminated a hodgepodge of anti-Azerbaijani and anti-Armenian statements that you can see now on screen. Azerbaijan is an artificial formation with people who believe they're more Oghuz vagabond tribes, and that's NKP's Karabakh now. And Mars is an ancestral Azerbaijani land, insidious and malicious little Armenian people must occupy it. Twitter's investigation enabled these fabricated accounts to be identified and to put an end to one of Armenia's cyber disinformation operations. Concerning the activity of these operations, Stanford Internet Observatory pointed out that this activity increased after each clash, however intermittent. Now, of course, the conflict of last year was not spared. Regarding these operations, the observatory also added, in confirming, I'm quoting them now, in confirming or fueling perceptions of Azerbaijani officials to an Armenian audience these further entrenched cross-border divisions. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, this campaign of disinformation and those other attempts by the Armenian government to fan ethnic tensions between the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians are wholly in violation of Articles 2, 4, 7 of the CERD. Once again, the Speaker repeats this paragraph. This campaign of disinformation is wholly in violation of Articles 2, 4 and 7 of CERD. Let me now look at the second precondition for indication of provisional measures, namely that there's a link between the rights that Azerbaijan seeks to protect and the measures requested. There again, this condition is met in the instant case. The provisional measures requested by Azerbaijan oblige Armenia to prevent VOMA and other similar groups from engaging in the incitement of racial hatred and racially motivated violence targeted Azerbaijanis, and to cease and desist incitement based on the fabrication of public and private hate speech attributed to Azerbaijanis on Twitter and other social media and traditional media channels. These measures aim specifically to protect Azerbaijanis from racist hate speech and from the risk of violence fueled by ethnic considerations by the ongoing Armenian campaign of incitement. These measures are thus directly linked to the rights relied on by Azerbaijan under Articles 2, 4, 5 and 7 of CERD. Let me now come to the last condition necessary for the indication of provisional measures, there whereby the measures demanded and requested are necessary to prevent an imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights in dispute. Now, this condition is also met. The provisional measures requested by Azerbaijan are indeed urgent, because Armenia continues to perpetrate violations of the CERD, which I've touched upon, which in turn puts the rights of Azerbaijanis in risk of irreparable prejudice. Madam President, the CERD Committee clearly observed in the past that when, I'm quoting them now, that when threats of racial violence are made, and especially when they are made in public and by a group, it is incumbent upon the state to investigate with due diligence and expedition. This echoes the dictum of the court in the Corfu Straits case, recalling, I quote you, "It is in every state's obligation not to allow knowingly its territory to be used for acts contrary to the rights of other states." End of quote. Despite this, to this day, Armenia has undertaken no measure sufficient to restrain or prohibit incitement to hatred and violence. If this court does not intervene to preserve the rights in issue, Armenia will continue to propagate disinformation and anti-Azerbaijani propaganda and will continue to authorize VOMA and other similar groups to propagate messages of racial superiority and to arm and train Armenians for an ethnic war against Azerbaijanis. As the CERD Committee underscored, I quote them here, "Threats and acts of racial violence can easily lead to other acts, such acts, and generate an atmosphere of hostility. This atmosphere of hostility can then degenerate, and I quote, lead to mass violations of human rights and genocide and in conflict situations." The threat of violence against Azerbaijanis is a real one and is even exacerbated by the intensification of calls to arms by the armed hate group VOMA. Last month, they published on Telegram the following declaration that you can see on your screens and tab 5 of your judges folders. We have to realize that the peaceful life is over. Guns should now be our best friend, brother and friend, and the skill to fight. All of us must become warriors. Stop writing these complaints and take up arms. End of quote. In its last activity report, which outlines work accomplished in September 2021, FOMA indicated that they had organised training camps for 55 people and given courses to more than 100 people in Yerevan. They also trained 8 instructors for the different branches of FOMA in Armenia and has looked for donations for vehicles and arms for weapons practice and protection in the populated areas along the borders. Madam President, one cannot insist too much on the urgency of the threat ensuing from Armenia's behaviour. The court has already judged that certain of these rights actually currently in dispute, specifically the right to the security of persons guaranteed by Article 5b of CERD, I quote you, are of such a nature that prejudice to them could be irreparable. And indeed, physical injury cannot be erased, no more than the mental and emotional consequences brought about by the constant threat of violence on the basis of ethnic origin alone. If the court does not indicate provisional measures, Azerbaijanis risk daily subjection to hate speech and violence on account of their national or ethnic origin. Distinguished members of the court, that brings me to the end of my oral presentation. The necessary criteria for the indication of provisional measures are clearly met with respect to the measures requested by Azerbaijan regarding Armenia's campaign inciting hatred and anti-Azerbaijani violence. So, I'd like to thank the court for its kind attention, and I would be grateful, Madam President, if you would call Ms. Natalie Reid to the podium.
I thank Professor Vasandashazoan for her statement, and I now invite Ms. Natalie Reid to take the floor.
Madam President, honorable members of the court, it is an honor indeed to appear before this court on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan. I will address the 4th provisional measure requested, which concerns Armenia's ongoing failure to investigate and thereby collect and preserve evidence of allegations of ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis. As set out in Azerbaijan's application, Armenia has committed repeated and continuing violations of CERD in the First Karabakh War, the 30 ensuing years of occupation, the Second Karabakh War and its aftermath, and continues to breach its CERD obligations to this day. As Mr. Donovan noted last week, Armenia has done little or nothing to investigate, much less prosecute, the perpetrators of heinous crimes against Azerbaijanis, including the Khojaly massacre in 1992. For decades, Armenia's persistent refusal to comply with its international obligations, including the duty to investigate and preserve evidence, has left Azerbaijani victims without effective remedies as required by CERD. In many cases, the evidence of the violation is evanescent. Victims die, suspects and witnesses disperse, physical evidence and records deteriorate or disappear. In that circumstance, a state need not actively destroy evidence for critical proof of violations to be lost. All it need do is nothing. Today, there is an urgent need for Armenia to commence effective investigations to preserve critical evidence of CERD violations. Armenia is currently on notice of multiple, credible, and substantiated allegations of ethnically motivated crimes committed by its servicemen against Azerbaijanis within the last 13 months. Yet it has given no serious indication of effective investigations of these allegations. Azerbaijan's request seeks to safeguard the well-established right to effective protection and remedies under Article 6 of CERD. As Azerbaijan and non-governmental organizations has extensively documented, there are credible allegations that during and after the Second Karabakh War, Armenian servicemen committed several ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis, including unlawfully executing, torturing, and mistreating Azerbaijani servicemen, and mutilating and desecrating the bodies of the Azerbaijani dead. To issue the requested measure, the court does not need to decide whether Armenia's conduct over the last 30 years, as set out in the application, has breached its substantive obligations under CERD. What is clear at this stage is that Armenia is currently breaching its duty of effective investigation under CERD with respect to recent, credible, and substantiated allegations. The CERD Committee has repeatedly affirmed this duty, explaining that, and I quote, when threats of racial violence are made, and especially when they are made in public and by a group, it is incumbent upon the state, under Article 6 of CERD, to investigate with due diligence and expedition. This obligation is a fortiori applicable when a violent assault has already occurred. Armenia is clearly on notice of these credible allegations, which have been made in public and by various independent groups. In addition to contemporaneous reports of multiple violations by media and non-governmental organizations, and public statements by Azerbaijan, the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly recently observed that the alleged hate speech and hate crimes that occurred during the 6-week war between September and November 2020 included, and I quote, the filming of horrific acts and their sharing on social media, end quote, including, quote, alleged acts of abuse and executions, as well as outrages committed on the bodies of dead servicemen. Several such videos reflecting offenses committed by Armenian servicemen were posted to and distributed on social media, including a notorious recording submitted to this court in Annex 38, in which an Armenian serviceman cuts the throat of an Azerbaijani border guard. It is neither necessary nor appropriate to discuss at length the brutal details of the crimes depicted in these videos. What is apparent is that both the conduct reflected in the videos and the purpose for which they were recorded and publicly shared implicate rights protected by CERD. Among other misconduct, the recordings capture the mistreatment of wounded Azerbaijani servicemen, the abuse and desecration of the bodies of dead Azerbaijani servicemen, and acts intended to humiliate and violate the dignity of such dead servicemen. As the Council of Europe rapporteur recognized, the filming and distribution of these videos further inflames tensions and excites ethnic animus, and should be considered as instances of hate speech in and of themselves. We direct the court's attention to Annexes 38 to 53 of Azerbaijan's evidentiary submissions, which include more than a dozen examples of such videos or posts that Azerbaijan formally submitted and thus formally provided to Armenia in interstate proceedings before the European Court of Human Rights 9 months ago. Critically, these recordings and other video and photographic evidence shared on social media platforms also contain valuable evidence for investigations of these serious allegations. In a number of them, including those submitted to the court in Annexes 40, 43, 45, 47, 49, 51, and 53, the faces of the apparent perpetrators and some witnesses are plainly visible, and their voices are clearly heard. The fact that many of these videos were posted and shared on social media also provides potentially valuable leads for identifying suspects and potential witnesses among those who recorded or uploaded the footage or commented on the posts. As shown in tab 14 of your folders, Armenia's own replies to the European Court of Human Rights have provided further substantiation for the allegations. Armenia has confirmed that several of the Azerbaijani servicemen mistreated in the videos were in Armenia's custody. And in some instances, Armenia has even confirmed the injuries suffered by those individuals. For instance, Armenia confirmed that an Azerbaijani serviceman, shown in one of the videos, was captured in the formerly occupied territories and transferred to Armenia based on the possible threat to his life. Armenia also verified that he had sustained blunt trauma and a penetrating wound to his chest, which correspond with the injuries in the video. Armenia has likewise confirmed the capture of 3 other servicemen whose mistreatment was recorded in these videos, has confirmed their transfer to Armenia based on a potential threat to their lives, and then confirmed injuries that at least one of them had sustained. And of course, the incidents captured in these videos are just those which are publicly known and reported. Armenia is no doubt aware of other similar crimes not widely disseminated on social media. Faced with this compelling evidence, Azerbaijan and the international community have repeatedly called on Armenia to investigate these hate crimes. In response to similar allegation involving Azerbaijani servicemen, the Azerbaijani authorities announced their intention to investigate as early as November 2020. The very next month, the Azerbaijani Prosecutor General's office announced the detention and charging of Azerbaijani servicemen for crimes including insults to the bodies of Armenian servicemen. In that December 2020 announcement, available at tab 10 of your folders, the office also declared that, and I quote, such criminal acts committed by the servicemen of the Republic of Azerbaijan are unacceptable, and that persons who have committed similar violations will be brought to liability by taking measures provided by law, end quote. In contrast, Armenia said and did nothing with respect to hate crimes against Azerbaijanis. By May 2021, a non-governmental organization whose report was cited repeatedly in Armenia's arguments last week noted that it is encouraging that the Azerbaijani authorities are willing and able to investigate and prosecute cases of despoliation of the dead and other violations of the laws and customs of war by members of their own armed forces. After noting Armenia's international obligations to conduct independent, prompt, public, and effective investigations of similar credible allegations, the report noted that, and I quote, to date, there is no indication that the government of Armenia has complied with these obligations. Nothing had changed by last month, when a Council of Europe report noted that both sides had provided information and videos relating to allegations of despoliation of the dead, noted that the Azerbaijani Prosecutor General's office had arrested and charged the 4 servicemen, but that the rapporteur is not aware of any investigation on the Armenian side. The same was true for allegations of torture and mistreatment of servicemen. The rapporteur received information substantiating allegations on both sides and notes that the criminal cases have been initiated by the Prosecutor General of Azerbaijan in some of these cases, but that as of September 2021, he is not aware of any investigations into any of these incidents by the Armenian authorities. So we come now to this hearing. Only 6 days ago, Armenia submitted, as part of its annexes to the court, a 1-page letter from its Prosecutor General's office stating that, and I quote, 6 criminal cases were initiated in December 2020. End quote. The letter then goes on to say that the cases were joined into a single proceeding in June 2021 and that pretrial investigation is ongoing. That is all that the letter says. It does not say which specific incidents are being investigated, in relation to which victims, or against how many suspects. It does not say which steps, if any, the Armenian authorities have taken to collect, preserve, or examine physical or electronic evidence, interview witnesses, identify suspects, or otherwise investigate these allegations. In short, it provides no indication that Armenia is in fact conducting effective investigations, and no information about the collection, preservation, or analysis of any evidence. In fact, the letter raises far more questions than it purports to answer. For example, if it were indeed true that 6 cases were initiated in December 2020, why did Armenia not disclose the existence of these investigations to the non-governmental organization that issued its report in May 2021? Or to the Council of Europe rapporteur who issued his report in September 2021? Armenia respectfully submits that, Azerbaijan respectfully submits that Armenia's silence over the last year speaks volumes louder than the single page it filed 6 days ago. That single page stands in stark contrast with the detailed information that Azerbaijan has submitted to this court. Just last week, Armenia's council denigrated Azerbaijan's efforts as, and I quote, a total of 6 cases, all of which are supposedly still under investigation or review, and nothing more. End quote. Lord Goldsmith demonstrated last week that this description of Azerbaijan's investigations and prosecutions is false. But it is apparently an accurate portrayal of Armenia's own circumstances. The document at tab 11 of your folder lists similar allegations involving Azerbaijani servicemen and the corresponding criminal investigations and prosecutions that Azerbaijan has undertaken. And the lengthy explanation of the specific steps that Azerbaijan's prosecutorial authorities have taken is at tab 12 of your folders. There is no such information from Armenia. Article 6 of the CERD requires that these grave allegations of ethnically motivated offenses, including the hate crimes Armenia ignores, must be investigated. Far from demonstrating its compliance, Armenia's letter confirms the grave risk that it will continue to ignore its obligations under the CERD and refuse to conduct effective, transparent investigations into the multiple serious allegations of crimes against Azerbaijanis. Now, when you hear from Armenia's council this afternoon, they may claim that the post-conflict context makes it difficult to conduct investigations into their own servicemen. That is no excuse. Within weeks of the trilateral statement in November 2020, Azerbaijan had publicly declared its intention to investigate credible allegations, and it has followed through, including completing investigations and referring cases to military court. All that Armenia can offer is a single piece of paper addressed to no one, supported by no public statement, and submitted only to this court on the eve of this hearing. That is not nearly enough. The right of Azerbaijanis to effective protection and remedies for the vicious acts of racial discrimination committed during and after the Second Karabakh War cannot be assured unless Armenia takes meaningful and effective steps to preserve and prevent the destruction of evidence. Armenia's ongoing failure to take these steps creates an urgent risk of irreparable harm, because the investigation of such acts becomes more difficult with each passing day. as the ICRC has recognized in the quotation displayed on your screens. A criminal investigation must be promptly opened because the collection of evidence is often only possible very soon after an incident. The effects of the passage of time are well known. A crime scene will change. Evidence may disappear. Memories fade. Witnesses can be threatened. Suspects may collude. A lack of promptness in the launching of an investigation can thus affect the rights of suspects, victims, and witnesses. Experience shows, as the ICRC continued, that investigations open long after the underlying offenses occurred are, and I quote, likely to face particular obstacles as regards the collection of information and evidence. As the Office of Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has recently observed, it is difficult to ignore the prejudice that past failings in an investigation can have on the ability of national authorities to subsequently carry out effective investigations. These considerations apply with particular force in the present context. There is a material risk that suspects could flee to escape prosecution, or that witnesses, including those who are released from military service or returned to their home countries, will be unable to be located. There is likewise a risk that the physical health of the victims, whom Armenia has confirmed sustained serious injuries, would decline over time, as could the recollections of witnesses to the offenses. The electronic evidence, including videos or other images shared on social media, may also disappear or be destroyed. Absent the provisional measures Azerbaijan seeks, Armenia's continued refusal to take meaningful steps to investigate ethnically motivated offenses, including the hate crimes committed by its servicemen, will make it impossible for Azerbaijanis to ever receive justice for these offenses. Azerbaijan seeks this urgent relief to prevent further grave and irreparable prejudice to its rights and those of its people. Thank you, Madam President, honorable members of the Court, for the privilege of appearing before you. I now respectfully request you to invite Mr. Donovan to address the Court.
I thank Ms. Reed for her statement, and I now invite Mr. Donald Donovan to take the floor.
Madam President, members of the Court, it's my honor to address you once again and to close the first round of submissions by the Republic of Azerbaijan. We engage in no hyperbole when we say that as a result of Armenia's acts and refusals to act, our Azerbaijani lives are at stake. Armenia refuses to provide maps of the hundreds of thousands of landmines it deliberately deposited on Azerbaijan's territory, with the purpose to cleanse that territory of ethnic Azerbaijanis. Armenia refuses to condemn, indeed it actively supports, militarized ethno-national groups such as VOMA, who are, as we speak, recruiting, training, and preparing Armenians for deadly warfare against Azerbaijanis. Armenia continues to wage a cyber disinformation campaign designed to incite violence and racial hatred against Azerbaijanis. And Armenia fails to collect and preserve evidence of ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis that it undoubtedly knows about. These are real threats, generating an immediate risk of irreparable prejudice to Azerbaijan's third rights. The circumstances require the Court to indicate provisional measures now. Last week, we explained why Armenia's own requests for provisional measures fail. Of course, we will not repeat those reasons today. I referred to Armenia's request solely for this reason. The fact that Armenia's request must be rejected should not affect the Court's assessment of Azerbaijan's request in any way. For sure, both states have alleged that the other has violated CERD. Both states have requested provisional measures. And both states have requested measures that relate in some way to the intense hostility that has characterized their relationship since Armenia invaded Azerbaijan in 1991 and seized 20% of its territory. Still, the respective requests differ fundamentally in the respects relevant here. Their engagement with the settled criteria by which the court determines whether to indicate provisional measures. The respective requests are not equivalent on their merits, and the court should not treat them with a false equivalence. In requesting the court to indicate provisional measures here, Azerbaijan respects the rigorous and disciplined approach this court has customarily taken to exercising its Article 41 authority. Indeed, we embrace that approach. Azerbaijan has identified with the requisite specificity and precision why each measure that it seeks satisfies the settled criteria for indicating provisional measures. Professor Lowe, Ms. Amirfar, Professor Basanda-Shazorn, and Ms. Reed made out that showing this morning. In the balance of my time, I want to walk the court through each measure requested by Azerbaijan for the purpose of making 2 points. First, that each measure is directed to real threats of irreparable prejudice, based firmly on specific facts and concrete circumstances. Second, that if indicated, none of the measures will visit any prejudice on Armenia's rights. I will take each measure in turn. First, Azerbaijan requests that Armenia provide comprehensive and accurate information on the location and characteristics of landmines in Azerbaijan. As Ms. Amirfar explained, these are landmines that Armenia has deposited to ethnically cleanse Azerbaijan's territory of Azerbaijanis and to prevent them from safely returning to their homeland. Distilling the request down, this is specific information which Azerbaijan has precisely identified, which Armenia possesses, which Armenia inexcusably refers to provide, and which, because Armenia refuses to provide it, Azerbaijanis stand at imminent risk of death and bodily injury. This is a textbook case warranting provisional measures. Every day, every minute, every second, even as we stand here today, a landmine could explode and a life could be lost. Conversely, there is no prejudice whatsoever to Armenia in turning over its landmine maps and information. Armenia cannot assert that it has a legitimate right that is served by withholding life-saving information. And surely it would not be legitimate for Armenia to continue to withhold the maps and information because they might at some point be useful as a bargaining chip. Let there be no doubt. The information Azerbaijan needs already exists and is in Armenia's possession. That point has been conceded by Armenia's Prime Minister. The international community has repeatedly called on Armenia to turn them over. There can be no confusion about what Azerbaijan is asking for, and there can be no reason for Armenia to continue to hold them. Because Armenia steadfastly refuses to do so, it should be so ordered. Second, Azerbaijan requests that Armenia cease and desist from planting further landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. This is specific conduct, which Armenia has been caught red-handed committing even as recently as May 2021, months after active hostilities ended and the formerly occupied territories were liberated. And it is specific conduct, which Armenia has no right to repeat. We are at a completely unacceptable juncture. Armenia has conceded that it has laid landmines, but at the same time, it has given no formal assurances that it will refrain from depositing any more on Azerbaijan's territory. Even if we hear Armenia deny this afternoon that it is continuing to deposit landmines in Azerbaijan, or argue that its May 2021 efforts were isolated, in the absence of a public, formal undertaking from the agent of Armenia this afternoon, made with the intention that Armenia be, quote, bound according to its terms, end quote, and of which the court could take note, Armenia must be ordered to stop. Respectfully, those are the only options available because the imminent risk of death and bodily injury from even one additional landmine being deposited is simply too grave to go unaddressed. Third, Azerbaijan requests that organizations operating in Armenia, such as VOMA, be prevented from inciting racial hatred and racially motivated violence targeted as Azerbaijanis. Let's be clear about this specific group. VOMA, as Professor Bosandashazon explained, is a hate group operating in broad daylight. It is not operating in the shadows, and there is no difficulty in identifying it. It has a website and several social media channels, all of which are proudly peppered with photographs of individuals holding and training with assault weapons. VOMA openly considers Azerbaijanis to be racially inferior to Armenians and a threat. It is operating warfare training centers for civilians in Armenia. Not only does Armenia refuse to condemn it, VOMA has been rewarded for its work with the Armenian armed forces. Thus, Azerbaijan's requested measure is precisely targeted at ordering Armenia to prevent a specific group and other specific hate groups like it from spewing racial hatred and inciting violence toward Azerbaijanis. Unless indicated, Azerbaijanis will be subject to an ever-increasing risk of violence, armed attacks, or worse. Conversely, again, Armenia would suffer no prejudice from this measure. In fact, Armenia's own laws contemplate that it will clamp down on virulent hate groups like VOMA, consistent with its CERD Article 4B obligations. Armenia previously assured the CERD Committee that its domestic law allows it to take steps to liquidate an organization, that's a quote, if that organization's activities are, quote, aimed at incitement of racial hatred, end quote. The obvious problem, of course, is that Armenia has taken no such steps with respect to VOMA, POGA, or any other hate group. That is not because doing so would encroach on free expression or free assembly or other rights. It's because Armenia endorses the group's anti-Azerbaijani activities, as its past cooperation with VOMA makes clear. Fourth, Azerbaijan requests that Armenia cease and desist its ongoing anti-Azerbaijani cyber disinformation campaign. Here again, this is specific conduct that Armenia has been caught red-handed doing. Twitter found that Armenia extensively manipulated its platform, quote, in order to advance narratives that were targeting Azerbaijan, end quote. Professor Bosandashazorn took you through all the evidence. Thousands upon thousands of tweets from fake accounts, all tied to Armenia. Here again, Azerbaijan is seeking a narrowly tailored order for Armenia to stop the specific unlawful acts which it has been caught out doing. And here again, unless those measures are indicated, Azerbaijanis will be subject to an ever-increasing risk of racial hatred, violence, or worse. It simply cannot be said that Armenia has any right or credible interest to protect by fomenting racial hatred online through fake news and disinformation. Nor can it be said that Armenia will be prejudiced by an order that it cease and desist its cyber disinformation campaign. The requested measure is restricted to identified speech that CERD prohibits, speech that directly incites racial hatred and violence, and that Armenia has disseminated strategically through fake accounts to have maximum impact. Fifth, Azerbaijan requests an order that Armenia collect and preserve evidence related to ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis. This is not a broad and sweeping evidence preservation order that will prejudice Armenia. This is narrowly tailored to allegations of ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis that Armenia is aware of, that it knows about. Given that a number of these crimes were committed in the 2020 hostilities and subsequent months, the temporal focus further narrows the compass. With specific knowledge of allegations of specific crimes, Armenia cannot suggest that the order would not provide sufficient guidance to permit compliance. But as Ms. Reed explained, that is precisely what Armenia is doing. And unless the measure is indicated, there will be no chance of holding perpetrators to account, and Azerbaijani victims of crime will be irreparably deprived of remedies in accordance with law. Finally, and very briefly on non-aggravation, because Azerbaijan's request meets the conditions for the indication of specific provisional measures, the court should exercise its power to indicate the non-aggravation measure sought by Azerbaijan in its request. Given the fundamental nature of the rights that are threatened by Armenia's CERD violations, the circumstances more than justify a non-aggravation measure. Madam President, members of the court, Azerbaijanis stand at risk of death, serious injury, and violence at any minute, all of which could be mitigated, if not prevented entirely, by the provisional measures requested by Azerbaijan. We may hear from Armenia this afternoon that Azerbaijan last week insisted upon a showing that CERD rights must be shown to be at imminent risk of irreparable prejudice by a real threat in specific circumstances. We stand firmly behind that insistence. We welcome the court examining Azerbaijan's request, as we have no doubt it will Armenia's, with the discipline that it customarily exercises. And that is because we are confident that each measure requested by Azerbaijan meets that standard. I thank the court for your attention. This concludes the first round of Azerbaijan's oral submissions on its request.
I thank Mr. Donovan, whose statement brings to an end the first round of oral argument of Azerbaijan, as well as this morning's sitting. The court will meet again this afternoon at 4 p.m. to hear the first round of oral argument of Armenia. The sitting is adjourned.
Thank you.